Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 11 minutes before 8. Sean, I will get to you as soon as I can, but we do need to pick up the latest on the strikes regarding the rail workers, and I have got Transport Secretary, the man very relevant to the conversation, hanging on the line, so I'll get to the calls when I can. It is, of course, Transport Secretary Mark Harper who joins me now, and it effectively this week can now be written off down to industrial action. The rail workers are walking out today, Wednesday, Friday and Saturday, and then, of course, a day to get the trains in place, so pretty much that's it. What are you doing to try and bring about some kind of resolution, Secretary of State? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, look, you're right about the impact of the strikes, and it's very damaging for the travelling public and businesses that depend on them. That's why when I took over this job, I was happy to meet with trade unions and listen to them and try and facilitate a resolution of the dispute. And they had an improved offer from Network Rail. They had an offer put on the table by the train operating companies. And one of the trade unions, Unite members, have accepted the Network Rail offer. The TSSA is balloting its members at the moment and have recommended acceptance. The RMT unfortunately rejected it out of hand, which is very disappointing. I think most of your listeners and viewers will think it's a very reasonable offer on the table. It's comparable with what people are getting across the wider economy. And it's very disappointing that the RMT have decided to go on strike.
I have it as a 5% pay rise this year and a 4% rise in 2023. Just to make sure, is that correct, Secretary of State?
That's right, 5% okay. And 4%, which
That's
I think is comparable with... But it's comparable with what's on offer on the rest of the economy. There isn't a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money, and I think the context is important. You know, post-pandemic, 20% of passengers have not returned to using railways. 40% of commuter traffic hasn't returned. And the rail finances therefore need to be got back into order. That's why I wanted to make a fair pay offer, or what the employers make a fair pay offer, but also there has to be a lot of reform in how the industry is run. So you have to have both of those things on the table. Some unions have accepted it, and it's disappointing the RMT haven't.
If Mick Lynch, the relevant union boss, were here, of course, I have to put to you, he would talk about the bonuses that have been paid to managers, the salaries that are enjoyed by managers, and shareholder payments as well.
Well, the rail industry hasn't done very well, actually, over the last few years. We had to put a lot of support into the industry during the pandemic. The taxpayer found £31 billion, which meant over the last couple of years, which meant that all of those rail workers in the industry, none of them had to be furloughed, people working on DFT contracts. None of them lost their jobs. They didn't have to deal with any of the challenges faced by people across the wider economy. But I want to make sure we have a sustainable rail industry, which is why we've got fair pay offers on the table. And I find it disappointing that the RMT have just rejected them out of hand.
Can we move up more broadly to your entire brief of transport? You'll be aware that some motorists were stranded on the M25, one of, if not the busiest motorway in the whole of the country, in some instances for 8 hours in part of Hertfordshire. Why would it appear we were unable to deal with, albeit heavy snow, but why were we so ill-prepared?
Well, my understanding, having listened to what National Highways have said, is a very significant amount of gritting did take place. But of course, that doesn't mean that you can deal with the consequences of the fact that it was a very severe cold snap and there was heavy snow across the country. And I know the staff that work for National Highways will have worked as quickly as they were able to get motorists back able to be making their journeys. But look, we do get...
Some people were there for 8 hours, Secretary of State. 8 hours in their cars.
Yes, no, look, we had a very significant cold snap. We had a lot of snow came down. We had a lot of gritting out on the roads to deal with that. But sometimes when you get heavy snow and you don't get a lot of traffic on the motorway, you do get the snow settle and it does cause congestion. But I know the staff of National Highways work incredibly hard to try and keep the roads moving and get the strategic road network up and running as soon as we could after the bad weather.
But also flights were cancelled. Why would it appear every time there is considerable snow, I'm not saying it's not considerable snow, Britain grinds to a halt? I don't know the same happens in Scandinavian countries.
Well,
why?
Nick,
can I put it to you, we're not prepared enough?
Of course. Well, I don't think you can say ground to a halt. Not over 90% of flights.
You did.
90% of flights took off as normal. There's some disruption caused by the bad weather, and airlines take steps to cancel some flights in advance to make sure they can keep the rest of them running. But 90% of flights were still operating as usual, and around 10%, I think, were cancelled. So I don't really think that's grinding to a halt. That's 90% of flights are taking place, and passengers that were on some of the cancelled flights will have been rebooked on the flights that were taking place. And I think that was a significant achievement by airlines and the airline system to keep flights going when there was significant bad weather.
You think we do have all the kit and all the readiness and preparedness that we need, that we require?
Yes, I mean, look, you can always look at these things and see whether we can make improvements. But I think if you look at what you mentioned on the airlines, the fact we had 90% of flights going even with that significant amount of bad weather, I think that is a good performance. I'm sure lessons will be learned after each of these to see whether we can do better. But I think actually the airline network continued to fly very successfully over the last few days.
Coming to an area a little bit out of your brief, there are reports that we might be using taxi drivers or taxis and their drivers in the place of ambulances if that industrial dispute goes ahead. Can you confirm that, Secretary of State?
So a couple of things. As you know, even when there's industrial action in the health service, there are arrangements put in place to make sure that life-threatening situations can still be responded to. So people phoning 999 with a life-threatening emergency will still be responded to by ambulances. The Department of Health is looking for the non-urgent cases to look at the option of block booking taxis to make sure people for those Category 3 and Category 4 emergencies can still be transported to hospital. Yes, that was set out by the Health Minister yesterday.
So that will be the use of the use of taxis as ambulances if they're required?
For life-threatening cases, an ambulance will still respond to a 999 call. There are arrangements in place that the health unions have with the health service to make sure that in life-threatening cases, an ambulance will still respond to people. For example, in the case of a heart attack, for the life-threatening cases, the non-urgent cases, that's where we're looking at booking alternative transport.
Lastly, can I read you a tweet that you put out 3 years ago to the day? I don't expect you to remember it, but you wrote the following: "Delighted to be re-elected as part of a brackets much larger close brackets Conservative team heading back to Parliament to hashtag get Brexit done and unleash Britain's potential under Boris Johnson's leadership." Secretary of State, how well has that gone? The economy's crashed, nurses are about to go on strike, there are no trains, and we've got the slowest growth in the whole of Europe. That's the potential under Boris Johnson, is it?
Well, I think the bit you're rather missing out there, two rather large things happened which you haven't mentioned. We had a global COVID pandemic, which meant that we had the biggest contraction of the economy for 300 years.
As did France.
And we've now got a
States.
war. And we've now got a war in Ukraine. And I think both of those things were not in our manifesto in 2019, and they're things we've had to deal with. And I make no apology for the huge amount of support that Rishi Sunak put in place when he was Chancellor, which meant that we saved millions of jobs, we saved thousands of businesses, and why actually, despite all the challenges that we undoubtedly face today from the inflation caused by Putin's war in Ukraine, we actually have very low unemployment. So huge challenges faced by this government, but I think huge challenges dealt with very successfully. Have we got a lot more to do? Yes, we have.
But those challenges, of course, have been felt around the rest of the world. We're not alone in facing the pandemic, and particularly in Europe, Putin's war. We look at France and Germany, and their economies are doing better than ours. So where's the potential?
Well, we're actually finding that all countries are having to deal with inflation. A third of the world next year is going to be in recession. We're all facing the same challenges. And actually, we're seeing faster growth this year than half of the G7. So, look, we have got huge challenges to deal with. I wouldn't pretend we haven't got to deal with getting inflation under control. But I think a global pandemic and a war in Europe are huge challenges. They're things the government is getting a grip on. And that's what the public would expect us to do under Rishi Sunak's leadership.
Grateful for your time. I do hope that you can negotiate peace breaking out on the railways. It would be in all our interests. Thank you. Secretary of State for Transport Mark Harper appearing here on LBC 2 before 8 the time. Now, I've carved out a minute. Sean in Frome. Talk to me about the strikes, the nurses' strike. Sean, you're on the radio. Go ahead. Thank you for holding.
Hi, Nick. Good morning.
Sir.
It seems to me, and I'm only obviously looking in it from the outside, that with goodwill, this is fairly quickly resolvable.